Okay, something I get asked about quite often is my finishing process. So what do I use to oil, dye, how do I antique, all of that type of stuff. I'm gonna run you through my process really quick. It's nothing fancy or new. I didn't come up with this method. There's a lot of people that use this method, but this is just my preferred way to get the final result that I like. And this all comes down to personal preference. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. This is not the only way or the right way to do it. You need to do it some experimenting and find out what you like, but this is what I like, so I'm gonna run you through that really quick. Okay guys, if you're new to all this, the type of leather that I'm using is vegetable tan leather. So because of the way that this leather was tanned is what allows me to carve and tool these designs in it. It can also be wet molded and shaped and a lot of different things you can do with vegetable tan leather. It's very versatile, but it's essentially raw material when you get it in, so it will accept dyes, oils, and there's a few steps that you need to put this leather through in order to make it a finished product when you're working with it. So over time, this leather will naturally accept oils from your hands and your skin when you touch it and handle it and work with it. And the more sun exposure it gets is going to cause the leather to age and darken and patina, similar to the saddle in this picture. This leather will become dark brown over time. That's just part of the aging process of this type of leather because it is a natural product and it is tanned in a very natural way. But because of that process, there are some people who don't oil their leather initially, but almost everybody that I know personally, including myself, we do oil our projects when we are starting that finishing process just to rejuvenate this leather and give it a little bit more life as we work with it. It is personal preference. There's a lot of types of oils out there that you can use. These are the two main products that I hear of people using, and I've used both. But as of right now, I am using neat's foot oil, which I believe is just oil that is extracted from the shin bones and hooves or feet bones of cattle, I think. Don't quote me on that. But that's what I use now. I don't have anything against olive oil. There was no particular reason to switch. I've used olive oil a lot and had really good results with it. I just wanted to experiment with this, and so that's what I use now, and that's what I'm going to be showing you in this video. The only difference that I've really noticed is, and it could be user error, but with neat's foot oil, it does dry and keep the leather a little bit darker when it dries compared to olive oil. So in the past, when I've oiled using olive oil, the leather will dry as it soaks the oil in, and it will still tend to be on the lighter side, whereas with neat's foot oil, it does tend to take on a little bit more darker coat. And it's not going to come out like this or anything unless you add a lot of heavy coats. But again, just do some experimenting, figure out what you like best and go with that. A lot of the leather work is personal preference, so similar to what I'm about to talk about, after I oil, I'm going to dye the borders of this. Some people like to dye their leather before they oil it. I personally feel like if I oil my leather before I do the dye work, the dye will just penetrate and spread and dry a little bit more evenly than if I were to do it before I oil. But again, just figure out what you like best and roll with that. Typically, the only thing that I'm going to do before I oil my leather is paint. So if I have a name, initials, or anything like that, then I'm going to paint on the leather before I oil it. But when I do oil it, like I'm about to show you, I just like to use these sheepskin pads. You can use a dauber or anything like that. And I just like to do one light to medium coat on the leather, and that's typically sufficient. And then I will allow it to dry for at least an hour, but I might get on another project and it might end up sitting for a couple hours. But you want to make sure that it does soak in and have plenty of time to dry evenly. And you also want to make sure that if you're doing any type of carving or tooling like I did, you want the leather to be completely dry once you start oiling. You don't want there to be any leftover moisture in it because it could potentially soak in uneven and leave some dirty dark spots too. So also be aware of that. But let's just go ahead and get this bad boy oiled up and then continue on with the video. So right now you might be thinking, dang, that's really dark, but it will eventually start to lighten up as this leather soaks in the oil. So just give it time, it'll start to lighten up. Those little burnish spots where my tool marks are will still hopefully stay dark, but that's all there is to it. Now we're just gonna let that sit there for a little bit and soak up, then we'll continue on with the process. Okay guys, something real quick. I have noticed that I can get long-winded in these videos, so I do apologize for that. If you're not necessarily interested in hearing me babble about all of the in-depth hows and whys and do's and don'ts, then go ahead and check out the description, and I will do my best to try and make a little condensed bulleted list of everything that I'm doing to hopefully get the point across a little bit quicker. But now that this belt has had time to soak up the oil, it's time to continue on with the dye process. So I'm just going to be using Phoebing's Pro Dye in the walnut color. There's nothing wrong with the regular leather dye that Phoebing's makes. I use both interchangeably. I don't have any issues with either of them. I can just usually only find the walnut color in the Pro Dye for some reason, so that's what I'm going to be using here. And essentially all I'm going to do is take these paintbrushes right here and very carefully dye these borders and all of these background pieces in order to give this a two-tone effect. So leaving all of the floral color natural, and then doing all that dye work will leave a pretty cool effect on this belt in the end. This can be a little bit of a messy process if you're not careful. Something that I do recommend that I don't really do, but I do recommend it, is taking this dye container and carefully pouring a little bit of dye into a smaller container or a lid or something that's a little bit easier to manage than this full container right here. When it is full, this one's fairly empty. These can be easily knocked over and will ruin a table or a project really quick. I've been very fortunate, knock on wood, that I haven't had that happen yet, so I'll probably pay for my sins one day. But that's something you might consider. I usually lay this little old cutting mat down when I'm dyeing because I don't care if it gets messy, but you might lay some cardboard down or some paper or something just to protect the surface that you're working on too, because even when you don't know it, this dye can be getting all over your fingers and your clothes and everything else, so just be very careful with it. But again, sorry for babbling. Let's just go ahead and get into this process. One thing you're going to notice right off the bat is that this dye will bleed quite a bit, so you want to be very careful and not get too close to anything you don't want to have dyed, because as soon as you touch that down, especially if you have a lot of dye loaded in your brush, it can run quite a bit. So be very careful and aware of that. Start out in a bigger area and then carefully work closer towards these little tiny areas like that. One other thing I really like to make sure that I get dyed is the inside of this little border here. Some people might not think it's a very big deal, but I like to just go ahead with my paintbrush and kind of get where that border's raised up a little bit, just to make sure that that dye work is rounded all the way off and bumping right next to the floral work. Okay, now that I have these borders dyed, I'm going to go ahead and give this belt a true two-tone effect, and so I'm going to go dye all these little background pieces carefully. Since I use bar grounding tools, you can sometimes get away with only dyeing the borders, and all these little circled areas will hold antique really well in the end. And if you don't dye these background pieces, it can still almost look like it is dyed after you do the antiquing. But I'm going to make sure that I give this belt a true two-tone effect, so I'm going to go do all this dye work in the backgrounding areas as well. And again, because this is bar grounded, which is all these little circles, these little areas almost have channels, if you will, so you don't have to use as much dye in your paintbrush or use as much action with it. You can kind of just load it with dye, touch a little area, and that dye will start to migrate throughout all of this background area. And it is ideal to use a little fine tip paintbrush to get into the small areas like this, but I'm going to go ahead and show you that really quick to kind of give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. This paintbrush I have right here isn't ideal, but I like to use a bigger paintbrush like this, load it with dye and get kind of the bigger areas, and then later go through and get all of the fine places. But as you can see, I just barely touched that and that dye started to migrate and bleed. So that is something to be aware of and be careful if you are dyeing bar grounded backgrounds. If you're using a matted tool to do your background work, it will still run and bleed a little bit like that, but not as much as when they are bar grounded like this. One other thing that I really like to do is dye these flower centers. I think that adds another cool accent color to the belt, so I'm going to go ahead and do that too. All right, we're back over here at the dirty table, which is just what I call this little setup because as you can tell, it can get pretty messy over here. And we're going to continue on with the process. This has been drying for a few hours now. I just like to let that dye really penetrate into the leather and have plenty of time to set up before I move on because I don't want to go to resist this belt and then pull a lot of that dye off. Some of it will still, that pigment will come off as you continue with the process, but that's not going to hurt anything. But you don't want to go ahead and rub this tan coat or any other product on it as soon as you get finished dyeing because that could mess it up a little bit. But anyways, there are some people that skip this step, but I really like to resist my leather before I antique it because that will help the antique only settle in all the decorative cuts and tool marks and leave some of this open negative space, I guess you could call it, more of the natural color, and it will help really have contrasting colors in the end result. And I just prefer that look because if you don't resist your leather, then when you put antique, whatever kind of antique on it, it's going to stain all of this and make it all a color. It'll still be darker in these tool mark spots and decorative cuts, but I don't like to make the entire natural colored look change colors, if that makes sense. It will get a little bit darker with this process, but it's not going to completely change the color. And you'll see a little bit more what I'm talking about here in a minute. But essentially all I'm going to do is take another piece of this sheepskin pad and put a little bit of tan coat on it. Tan coat is what I like to use as resist. Again, this is just personal preference. There's a lot of different products out on the market. This is just what I like. That's what I've grown used to, and so that's what I use. But if you're interested in these pads also, you can check them. Well, not the pad, but I buy full hides of this, and I like to cut it in these little squares and then trim it up, and it works perfect for like applying antique or resist and cleaning up projects. But you can get the full hides either. I like to get them from Weaver Leather Supply or Springfield Leather Company. I think they're around $100, maybe more. But again, just you can be pretty frugal with them and they last a while, the full hides do. But that's just what I like to use. But essentially I'm just gonna rub that tan coat in on this belt, and that's gonna bring, the dye might even look a little dull right now. That's gonna bring some of that color and shine back into that dye work, but it's also gonna resist the belt. And I like to let that resist set up for at least 30 minutes, but again, I might get on something else and it might sit for a few hours. That's perfectly fine. But I like to let it sit for at least 30 minutes before I go apply my antique. So let's go ahead and get this thing resisted. A little bit goes a long way with this product, but don't be afraid to, put a good amount on here when you're resisting it because, again, you want to make sure that you do get good full coverage with it. And I'm just going to slowly work it in. It looks like it is changing the color of that natural look a little bit. It's just kind of making it wet. It's not going to stay crazy dark like that with this product, but it is bringing that shine and glow back into the dye work, as you can see too. I feel like sometimes I might get a little crazy with the amount that I use, but it still comes out the way I like, so don't be afraid of it. All right, now I'm gonna let that sit there for at least 30 minutes, but like I said, I could get on something else and it might be a couple hours before I get back over here on this. But I do want that to be good and dry, and then we're gonna come over here and put some antique paste on it here in a little bit. As far as the antique itself, I prefer to use the Phoebing's antique paste in either this dark brown color or the medium brown color. For this belt, we're going with the dark brown. This is what the product actually looks like. And I've honestly never really used anything else, so this is about the only thing I can speak on. I will say it does take quite a bit of experimenting to actually get results that you might like and to figure out how to continuously replicate those results, because you could follow the exact process that I've showed you throughout this video and still get different results. Everybody's work comes out different, so it might be annoying that I've said it this many times, but it does just take some experimenting and figuring out what you like and then rolling on with that. I prefer to use these daubers to apply the antique, but you can use just about anything. I've personally used my hands and my fingers, a sock, those sheepskin pads, but I like to buy these big packs of these daubers now and work with them because they can get in all the little cuts and crevices a little bit easier and better. I accidentally bought these jumbo daubers like this, so I've been just using a little lighter and burning them down to get to this little normal size, and that works just fine. So when you're antiquing, you really want to make sure that you get all of that product into every little cut and tool mark that you can, because that is what's going to give all of the contrasting colors and make all of the fine details pop. And this is where a lot of people's process can vary from one another. As soon as I get done rubbing this antique in like I just did, I immediately like to go and wipe that top coat off, and you can use whatever you like, but I like to use these blue shop towels. Some people will start buffing it out, but I like to just get the top coat first right now, and then I'll let it sit for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'm going to come back in with some sheepskin pad like this and buff it to get any little puddles or pools cleaned out. And then from then on out, I'm going to let it dry for maybe 30 minutes to an hour, and then I'm going to come back with another coat of tan coat, and that's going to clean it up some. Again, take some experimenting, but this is what I like. So I like to just take this and try to get the majority of the top coat. I don't like to start rubbing or buffing or getting too crazy. But you don't want this stuff to sit and pile up and puddle up a lot, because if this stuff dries in a really thick area, it can harden up and the entire area can flake and fall out of the project in a short amount of time, and you don't want that to happen. You do want to make sure that the antique really only just stains those burnished areas and tool marks and gets in all the cuts. But again, it is personal preference. I just have had projects in the past where I let a big hard area or a big thick area of antique dry up, and then if the leather bends, which a belt is always going to be bending, those areas can just kind of flake out and then just be missing a random place of antique, and you don't want that to happen. So now that top coat's rubbed off, like I said, I'm going to let that sit there for maybe 5 minutes and just let it dry for a little bit, but not get really dry, and then come back and buff it out and get all of those thick areas cleaned up. So as you can see, when you come buff all of those thick coats off, it still leaves antique in these little areas, but you don't want those big thick clumps to dry up. It does look cool, but it can flake and fall out. So that's just something to be aware of. You don't have to use this method, but I don't like seeing big missing pieces of antique in my projects. So here's what we're working with now. I will probably let this sit for around 30 minutes to an hour now and let what's left of that antique dry. And then I'm going to come back through with another quick coat of tan coat, and that'll clean up any muddy, messy look that it has. And that's about it for this process. that tan coat will really start to bring back the luster of that natural color. I don't like to get too crazy with my action on this last coat of tan coat because you can start to pull up a lot of that antique. If you read the bottle on this tan coat, it says used to thin Phoebing's antique finish, so it will definitely thin it out. But the last thing you want to do is start pulling a lot of that out of the project. This is really just to kind of seal it up and clean it up a little bit. And there it is. Alright, here's the finished product one last time. One other thing that I like to do in the end is add a very light coat of tan coat along this edge, but that's a whole nother process and I'll save that for a future video. That's going to wrap it up for this one. If you have any questions, make sure to send me an email or leave it in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. Just like I said earlier, that is not the right way or the only way to go about finishing your leather goods. I would highly recommend doing some experimenting, trying some other products, and just figuring out what works best for you. Because obviously not everybody's going to like the same results, and it's really hard to replicate the same results, even if you do the same method as I did. So do some experimenting. If you haven't already, please make sure that you like the video and go subscribe to the channel. That support means a lot, guys. But until next time, we'll see you.